There's a place in Louisiana where most people who enter will never leave. Not because they can't find the exit, but because they'll die there. It sits on 18,000 acres of land that once grew cotton picked by slaves. Today it grows something else, despair. They call it Angola. And on a special part of this massive prison, there are 55 men waiting to die. But before we talk about death, let's talk about what it's like to be alive in America's most notorious prison. Picture this. You wake up in a cell so hot that sweat drips down your face before you even stand up. It's summer in Louisiana, and the temperature inside your tiny room has climbed past 100 degrees. There's no air conditioning. There never has been. The air is thick and heavy, like breathing through a wet blanket. You've been in this cell for 23 hours. Yesterday it was 23 hours. Tomorrow it will be 23 hours again. This is death row at Angola Prison. The men here aren't waiting for life to begin. They're waiting for it to end. Some have been waiting for decades. The longest has been here for over 40 years. But something strange happened in 2021. Something that changed everything for these men, at least a little bit. The prison made a deal. Death row inmates would no longer be locked in their cells for 23 hours a day. They could spend time together now. 4 hours of congregate time, they called it. For men who had spent years seeing nothing but 4 walls and a toilet, this was huge. But why did the prison suddenly decide to be nicer? What made them change their minds after all these years? We'll come back to that question. First, you need to understand how someone ends up on death row at Angola. In Louisiana, there's only one crime that can land you on death row: first-degree murder. But not just any murder. It has to be especially terrible. Murder during a robbery, murder of a police officer, murder of a child. Let me tell you about some of the men waiting to die. There's James Copeland. He's 65 years old now, and he's been on death row since 1986. That's 39 years. Think about that, 39 years of waiting to die. James was just 19 when he and another man did something unforgivable to an 11-year-old boy named Joseph. The details are too horrible to share here, but James admitted he pulled the trigger. Then there's Nathaniel Code. He's been on death row since the year 1991. Police suspected him in the deaths of 8 people in Shreveport, including a child. He says he didn't do it. He's said that for over 30 years now, but the courts disagreed. And there's Anthony Bell, who walked into a church in 2006 and shot 5 people, including his own wife. His brain, doctors would later say, was damaged. He had bipolar disorder that nobody had diagnosed. But by then, it was too late. The jury had already decided his fate. These are just 3 of the 55 men on death row. Each one has a story. Each one committed a crime so terrible that the state of Louisiana said they must die for it. But here's the strange part. Louisiana hasn't executed anyone in over 15 years. Why? What's been stopping them? If you're finding this story as fascinating as we do, hit that subscribe button. We're just getting started, and trust me, what comes next will shock you. The last person Louisiana executed was Gerald Bordelon in 2010. After that, the execution chamber went quiet. Not because Louisiana didn't want to execute people. They did, but they ran into a problem. The companies that make the drugs used for lethal injections stopped selling them to prisons. They didn't want their medicines used to kill people. So Louisiana was stuck. They had 55 men sentenced to death, but no way to carry out the sentence. For 15 years, those men waited. Some probably hoped the wait would last forever. Others, strangely enough, wanted it to be over. Living on death row can be worse than death itself, some inmates say. But in March 2025, everything changed. The state announced they would start executing inmates again, and this time they wouldn't use lethal injection. They had found a new method: nitrogen gas. The first man scheduled to die was Jesse Hoffman, Jr. He was 46 years old and had been on death row since 1997. His crime happened in 1996 when he was just 18 years old. A young woman named Molly Elliott was raped and murdered in St. Tammany Parish. Jesse said he didn't do it. His lawyers fought for years to stop his execution. They argued that nitrogen gas was cruel, an unusual punishment, that it would cause terrible suffering. But the courts said no, the execution would go forward. On March 18, 2025, after 15 years of silence, Louisiana's execution chamber opened its doors again. Jesse Hoffman became the first person in Louisiana to be executed with nitrogen gas. But Jesse's execution revealed something troubling about death row at Angola, something that had been hidden for decades. Let us go back to that question from earlier. Why did Angola suddenly start letting death row inmates spend time together in 2021? The answer isn't what you'd expect. It wasn't because the prison decided to be nice. It was because they got sued. For decades, death row inmates at Angola lived in what's called permanent solitary confinement. Imagine being locked in a bathroom-sized cell for 23 hours every single day. No programs, no classes, no real human contact except when guards brought you food or took you to that 1 hour of recreation. Some men went years without touching another human being. Studies show that this kind of isolation does terrible things to the human mind. Men started talking to themselves. Some forgot how to have conversations. Others lost their grip on reality completely. Remember Percy Davis? He's been on death row since 1999 for killing 2 convenience store clerks. After years in solitary confinement, doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia and psychosis. In 2005, a court found him too mentally ill to execute. But here's the dark twist. The isolation that made him mentally ill happened after he arrived on death row. Did Angola's conditions make him too sick to execute? If so, what does that say about the other 54 men living in those same conditions? In 2021, lawyers sued the prison. They argued that permanent solitary confinement was torture, that it violated the Constitution's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Angola agreed to settle. They promised to end automatic solitary confinement for death row inmates. Now, these men could spend at least 4 hours a day together. They could eat meals as a group. They could talk, play cards, watch TV together. For men who had spent years alone with their thoughts, this was like being reborn. But the settlement revealed something else, something that made people ask uncomfortable questions. If the conditions on death row were bad enough that the prison had to change them, were they bad enough that executing these men was wrong? After all, some of these men had been living in torture-like conditions for 20, 30, even 40 years. Wasn't that punishment enough? Angola Prison has a cemetery. It's called Point Lookout. Over 3,000 people are buried there. Most of them died in prison. Their families never claimed their bodies, so Angola buried them. There's a saying at Angola, life means life. 90% of the people who enter Angola will die there. Not on death row, just in regular prison. Because in Louisiana, when they say life in prison, they mean it. You will die behind those walls. Drop a comment below and tell us, should someone who has already spent 30 or 40 years on death row still be executed? We want to know what you think. But death row is different from regular prison. It's prison within a prison. A special kind of hell reserved for the worst of the worst. The cells are small, 6 feet by 9 feet. That's about the size of a parking space. Inside there's a metal bed, a toilet, and a sink. That's it. No privacy. Guards can see everything you do. The heat in summer is unbearable. Temperatures climb past 100 degrees, and there's no escape. Men have passed out from heat exhaustion. Some have gotten seriously sick. In winter, it's freezing. No heating either. Just cold concrete and metal. The food comes through a slot in the door. 3 times a day, a tray appears. Sometimes it's warm. Usually, it's not. You eat alone in your cell, staring at walls covered in scratches left by men who came before you. Some of those scratches are calendars. Men marking off days, weeks, years. Counting time until ... what? Until their execution? Until they die of old age? Until they simply go mad? Now let me tell you about a group called the Angola Five. In December 1999, 5 inmates tried to escape from Angola. Their plan went terribly wrong. During the attempt, they took hostages. One of those hostages was Captain David Knops, a correctional officer. Captain Knops was beaten to death. When it was over, all 5 men were caught. But here's where things get strange. Even though 5 men participated in the escape attempt, only 2 received the death penalty: David Brown and Jeffrey Clark. And here's the part that made people suspicious. David Brown was the only black participant in the escape. The others who didn't get death sentences, they were white. Brown was tried by an all-white jury. His lawyers argued that prosecutors hid evidence that would have helped his case. They said a conversation between 2 other inmates showed that Brown didn't even know about the plan to kill Captain Knops. The case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. They refused to hear it. David Brown remains on death row today, still claiming he didn't know they were going to kill anyone. Stories like David Brown's make you wonder, how many men on death row are actually guilty of what they re-accused of? How many are sitting in those hot cells, counting the days, knowing they didn't do what everyone says they did? Let me tell you about Jimmy Duncan. In 1998, Jimmy was convicted of a terrible crime in Caddo Parish. A young woman was murdered, and the jury said Jimmy did it. They sentenced him to death. Jimmy went to Angola. He lived in that tiny cell. He sweated through those summers and froze through those winters. Year after year after year. 27 years passed. Then, in February 2025, something incredible happened. A judge looked at Jimmy's case again and said, "Wait a minute. Something's not right here." The judge released Jimmy on bail while his case gets reviewed. After 27 years on death row, Jimmy Duncan walked out of Angola. He might be innocent. Think about that. 27 years of waiting to die for something he might not have done. 27 years in a cell the size of a parking space. 27 summers of unbearable heat. 27 winters of bone-chilling cold. And if he is innocent, he's not getting those years back. But Jimmy's story raises a terrifying question. If one man on death row might be innocent, how many others are there? Angola sits on land with a dark history. Before it was a prison, it was a plantation. Slaves worked those fields, picking cotton under the brutal Louisiana sun. The prison is even named after the African country where many of those slaves came from. Some people say Angola never stopped being a plantation. It just changed who worked the fields. Today, inmates at Angola still work the land. They grow crops. They tend animals. They make license plates. The prison is self-sufficient, meaning it grows most of its own food and makes most of what it needs. But the men on death row don't work in the fields. They're considered too dangerous. Instead, they sit in their cells day after day waiting. The prison is massive, minus 18,000 acres. That's bigger than Manhattan. It's so big that it has its own zip code. Guards patrol on horses. There's a golf course for guards and visitors, not inmates. There's even a rodeo that happens twice a year where inmates compete for prizes. But the men on death row never see any of this. Their world is much, much smaller. Not everyone on death row is a man, though. There's one woman. Her name is Antoinette Frank. In 1995, Antoinette was a police officer in New Orleans. She was supposed to protect people. Instead, she walked into a Vietnamese restaurant called Kim An Han and murdered 3 people during a robbery. One of the victims was another police officer named Ronald Williams. He was working security at the restaurant. Antoinette shot him in the back of the head while he was kneeling down. She also killed 2 members of the family that owned the restaurant. But here's the twist. One person survived by hiding. A young man named Chauvu witnessed everything. He saw Antoinette, still in her police uniform, commit the murders. Antoinette Frank became the first woman in Louisiana to be sentenced to death in over 40 years. She's been on death row since 1995. Unlike the men at Angola, Antoinette isn't housed there. She's at a different facility. But she's still waiting to die, just like the 55 men at Angola. Let me tell you about another man on death row. His name is Daniel Blank. Daniel was convicted of killing 5 elderly people in their homes between 1997 and 1999. The police called him the River Parishes serial killer. But here's what's strange. There was no physical evidence linking Daniel to any of the crimes. No fingerprints. No DNA. Nothing. What the police had was a confession. Daniel confessed during a 12-hour interrogation. Later, his lawyers would argue that the confession was forced. That after 12 hours of questioning, Daniel would have said anything just to make it stop. In 2016, Louisiana scheduled Daniel's execution. He had 1 month left to live. Then something happened. The Louisiana Supreme Court stopped the execution. They ordered that evidence in the case be retested using modern DNA technology. That was in 2016. It's now 2025, and Daniel Blank is still on death row, still waiting. Did he kill those 5 people? Or did he confess to crimes he didn't commit just to end 12 hours of interrogation? Nobody knows for sure, and that's the problem. If this documentary is making you think differently about the death penalty, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Tell us, should DNA evidence be required for a death sentence? We read every single comment. Now, let's talk about what death row does to families. When someone is sentenced to death, they're not the only one who suffers. Their family suffers too. Visiting someone on death row at Angola is difficult. The prison is in the middle of nowhere, hours away from most cities. Families have to drive for hours just to see their loved one for a short visit. And what do they talk about during these visits? What do you say to someone who's waiting to die? Do you talk about the weather? About what's happening in the world outside? Do you pretend everything is normal? Some families stop visiting. It's too painful. Too hard to keep saying goodbye, knowing that one day it will be the last goodbye. Other families never stop. They come every month, every week if they can. They bring photos and stories from the outside world. They remind their loved one that someone still cares, even if society has decided they should die. But here's something most people don't know. Some of the victims' families don't want executions either. When Jesse Hoffman was executed in March 2025, you might think Molly Elliott's family was relieved. Justice served, right? But some victims' families say executions don't bring closure. They say it just creates more death, more pain. That watching someone else die doesn't heal the wound of losing someone they loved. Other families feel differently. They wait for years, sometimes decades, for the execution to happen. They feel like justice hasn't been served until the person who killed their loved one is dead, too. There's no right answer. Just pain on both sides. Here's something that will surprise you. Angola has a hospice program. Hospice is usually for people who are dying from illness, not for people sentenced to death. But remember, 90% of Angola's inmates will die there. Many will die of old age or disease, even if they're not on death row. And here's the really surprising part. Death row inmates can volunteer to be hospice workers. That's right. Men who are sentenced to die can volunteer to care for other dying inmates. They sit with them. They talk to them. They hold their hands as they take their last breaths. Why would a man sentenced to death volunteer to watch other people die? Maybe because taking care of someone else gives their life meaning. Maybe because in helping someone else face death, they find a way to face their own. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's the only way to feel human again. Let me tell you about Henry Broadway. In 1993, Henry and his friends tried to rob someone making a bank deposit. The person was being protected by Officer Betty Smothers, a police officer working security. Henry and his friends shot at the police car. Officer Smothers died at the scene. Henry was sentenced to death. So was his friend Kevin Brumfield. But in 2015, something happened. A federal court looked at Kevin's case and said he had an intellectual disability. Because of this, his death sentence was changed to life in prison. Henry Broadway is still on death row. Both men participated in the same crime. Both pulled triggers, but only one is still sentenced to die. Is that fair? Is that justice? Here is something else to think about. Many of the men on death row have serious mental illnesses. We already talked about Percy Davis, who developed schizophrenia and psychosis after years in solitary confinement. But others arrived at Angola already sick. There's a man named Scott Borg on death row. In 1997, a court found him incompetent. He was diagnosed with delusional disorder of the persecutory type. In simple terms, Scott's brain doesn't work right. He believes people are out to get him, even when they're not. Should someone with a serious mental illness be executed? Some people say no, that you can't punish someone who doesn't fully understand what is happening to them. Others say the crime still happened. The victims are still dead. Mental illness doesn't change that. Again, there's no easy answer. Let's talk about the youngest person on death row at Angola. Actually, there isn't one anymore. But there used to be. Leigh Derrick Campbell was just 18 years old when he killed a liquor store clerk during a robbery in 2002. He was convicted and sentenced to death. At his trial, Derrick did something shocking. He asked to represent himself. The judge allowed it. Derrick didn't call any witnesses in his defense. He barely said anything at all. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Later, lawyers would argue that Leigh Derrick was profoundly mentally ill, that he wasn't capable of defending himself, that letting an 18-year-old mentally ill kid represent himself in a death penalty case was wrong. But by then, it was too late. Leigh Derrick was already on death row. He's been there for over 20 years now. He's 42 years old. He spent more of his life on death row than he spent free. Now let me tell you about the Angola Rodeo. Twice a year, Angola Prison hosts a rodeo. It's one of the longest-running prison rodeos in America. Thousands of people buy tickets to watch inmates ride bulls, rope calves, and compete in other events. It's entertainment. Families come. They eat cotton candy and hot dogs. They cheer and clap. But the men on death row never participate. They never even see it. While thousands of people are laughing and having fun just miles away, the death row inmates sit in their cells, listening to distant sounds of joy they'll never experience again. Some people think the rodeo is cruel, that it turns inmates into performers for public amusement, like the gladiators in ancient Rome. Others say it gives inmates something to look forward to, a chance to feel normal, even if just for a day. The men on death row don't get to have that debate. They just sit in their cells and wait. Here's a question nobody likes to ask. What if we're executing innocent people? Since 1973, over 190 people have been released from death row in America after being proven innocent. That's almost 200 people who were sentenced to die for crimes they didn't commit. How many innocent people were executed before we realized they were innocent? We'll never know. In Louisiana, DNA testing has changed some cases. Modern science can do things now that were impossible 20 or 30 years ago, but not every case has DNA evidence. And even when it does, getting it tested takes years of fighting in court. Meanwhile, the clock keeps ticking. Men keep aging in their cells. Some die of natural causes before they're ever executed. Others lose their minds to the isolation and heat. And some, like Jimmy Duncan, might walk free after spending decades waiting to die. Before we end, hit that subscribe button one last time. Share this documentary with someone who needs to see it. And drop a comment telling us what you think about everything you just learned. Let me leave you with one final thought. Right now, at this very moment, there are 55 men sitting in cells at Angola Prison, waiting to die. Some have been waiting for 40 years. Others for just a few. Some of them did horrible things that haunt the families of their victims every single day. And all of them are waiting in the heat, in the cold, in the isolation, for the day when the state of Louisiana will call their name and say, Today is the day you die. Louisiana has started executing people again after 15 years. Jesse Hoffman was just the beginning. More executions are planned. The execution chamber at Angola, silent for so long, is open for business again. Is today the day it all ends? This is life on death row at Angola Prison. This is what justice looks like in Louisiana. Some deserve it, some might not. And all of them are just ... waiting.